Okay. Good evening, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me. I think we're live now. We're going to get underway with the main presentation of today very shortly. So I'll just wait for people to join. If you're already here, if you're already live, don't be shy. Put a comment in the chat section. Introduce yourself. Say where you're from. Of course, I've left a message there for everyone. I'll be starting our presentation shortly, but if you do throughout the course of my presentation, and I hope you do, I have a question to ask. There is an Ask the Question section at the bottom of the screen. So please enter your question there, and you can also vote for questions as well. So if you see another question from someone else that you would really like answering, don't be shy about voting that up, and I'll answer all those at the end of the presentation. So we'll get going soon. Obviously, we are here to go through a journey through IPA today. So you'll get to see the history geek side of me as well as the yeast and fermentation side of stuff today. So I'll get going and enter presentation mode very soon. As I say, any questions, add them into the Ask the Question section. And the format of today is going to be a main presentation, which depending on how distracted and geeky I get with historical information, will be around 40 to 45 minutes long. And then we'll go into a Q&A session. And as I say, I'll answer all your questions that pop up at the end. And I hope that you'll have many technical and interesting questions for me to come back to after the presentation. So without further ado, I'll start. We've got a heck of a lot of information to go through. So I'm entering presentation mode now. Just hide that sharing box, and hopefully you can all see my screen, and hopefully I'll have confirmation that we're good to go on that very soon. So a journey through IPA. Really, I want to tell the story of IPA, not just from a technical standpoint, a scientific standpoint, but from a historical one as well. So I really want to give you a flavor of where IPA came from historically, and how it developed and evolved as a style, and fast forwarding through to the modern day to have a look at how IPA is diversified and evolved and come back to us, having had a bit of time off during the 20th century. And really, of course, I want to focus on yeast and the fermentation side of things. So we'll have a look, first of all, at the content for today. As I say, we'll start with the evolutions and the origins of IPA. So we'll have a glance back through history of how it all started. We'll have a look at how the craft beer revolution came into being and how it reignited our love and passion for IPA. We'll look at some of the modern IPA styles and variations, and crucially, we'll have a look at IPA solutions, the role of yeast. Where does yeast come into the IPA story, and what's next in terms of fermentation for IPA? So let's start first of all with the origins and the story of IPA. And we think, mostly when we think of IPA, we think of Victorian Britain, we think of the Industrial Revolution and these big industrial brewers that dominated, big IPA production. But going back a bit further, I think to start the story of IPA, we have to go not to the 19th century, but in fact back into the 1700s of Britain and the Industrial Revolution. And I think the 1700s saw the start of what we can refer to as modern brewing, and certainly modern British brewing. So this is a period of time, the start of industrialization and the commercialization of beer. And one key element of the Industrial Revolution was the move of people from countryside into large towns and cities, and brewing largely reflected this as well. We had brewing brewing on estates, so that would be farms, maybe even monasteries, private estates, and beers being brewed in pubs, in taverns as well. So very small productions, very localized. But as soon as we get the rise of large towns and indeed cities, we have this centralization of people and start the centralization of brewing as well. So we start to get our first really large breweries in Britain. And this is a really important time in terms of scientific understanding. It's also a really important time in terms of technological advances. So we have things like steam production, and crucially for brewing as well, we have the first hydrometers and thermometers being used. So it's a time that ultimately brought greater consistency and control in the brewing process. Now, when we think of IPA, we really think about hops as the defining ingredient, the defining character of IPA. But I want to start off actually, and hopefully my malting friends will be pleased that I'm making this point. Actually, the influence of malt is really key to IPA. So up until the 1700s, we had the malting process, and more specifically the kilning process. So this is the heating of the grain at the end of the germination process. Kilning was largely done with inconsistent and unstable fuel sources. The examples I cite there on the slide are straw and wood. So we have malted barley that would have been, to some extent, relatively inconsistent, certainly from a colour standpoint and certainly from a flavour standpoint. In the 1700s, we start to get the use of coke as a fuel source, and this move to coke, which was coal-derived, means lower temperatures, it means more consistent temperatures, and crucially, it means a cleaner flavour for malt as well. So it was this new malting technology, and it's incredible to think that something as basic as a fuel source could have brought around such greater control and advantages to the malting process. But this technology, this changes in production, really allowed for new beer styles. So the pale malts that were produced using these new methods would form the basis of different beers, which would eventually become IPA in the 1800s. So malt incredibly crucial to the story of IPA. And then, of course, we all know and recognize IPA as being synonymous with being shipped on boats. And indeed, the development of export in the 17 and 1800s is obviously of paramount importance, really crucial to the story of IPA. Beer on boats was nothing new. Sailors had beer rations on boats as an alternative to water. And it was really the exporting and trade of goods in the 1700s which really defined Britain in that era. We did have, of course, commercial exports from British ports, and primarily this was export to the various colonies of the British Empire. Obviously, a very important part of British history, and as export grew really as the empire reached its peak worldwide. So we had very early examples of goods, including beer, being shipped to all manner of places. From London, this was primarily to America, where the British were mostly using North America as a war ground to fight the French. But we also had beer exports to as far away as Australia and the West Indies from ports in Bristol in the southwest of the UK. Initially, we see exports again from London going to India, and obviously we're going to talk about that in detail. And we have the export of beers to the Baltic and Russian region as well. And this was, again, via London, but largely produced by BURTON breweries. And we'll go into this in a bit more detail as well. So exporting beer was nothing new, certainly in the 1700s. And it was really the export and the industrialization of beer production that led to the establishment of major brewing. And in the UK, this was principally London and Burton-upon-Trent. So obviously beer was in varying quality on boats. There were reports of it being sour, as you'd expect, flat, turbid, hazy, perhaps not so far away from today's brewing. But I think by observation more than design or scientific understanding, it was observed that stronger beers survived the longer journeys. And hops were an excellent preservative, and hops, use in brewing didn't really come until the kind of latter stages of the medieval period and later. But we now know that hops have a great bacteriostatic quality. They're great at helping the preservative quality of beer, and these were seen, I think, as I say, more by observation than anything, that beers with more hops in survived well. And this journey to India that we can see on the map there, from Britain, in northwest Europe, round the Cape of Africa and through to India, it was a 6-month journey, and not only did that long time on the ball will affect beer, but the temperatures as well. It crosses the equator not once but twice. So generally speaking, a lot of records indicate that brewers were adding in somewhere 30 to 35% more hops into barrels doing this long journey, direct to the cask, of course. So there were certain beer styles that were coming into production in the late 1700s that we can perhaps question, did this influence early IPA production? So we have, for example, October beer and what we refer to as stock ale. So these were beers that were brewed with very fresh ingredients, harvest crops. So that would be the malt in September, October time, and hops around the same time would have been harvested, and fresh beers would have been made with them. So very much like a fresh ingredient beer. And in that sense, we can consider these harvest beers. They were generally high gravity, and they were certainly highly hopped. Somewhere in between kind of 8.5% to 10% ABV was typical for an October beer. And actually, they were relatively low in attenuation, so there are a lot of records that indicate they were quite sweet, with very high final finishing gravities. Despite the high alcohol, so they were quite sweet. These strong, highly flavored October beers would have been stored and aged in wood for anywhere between 2 and 3 years. So clearly aging and conditioning was key to the production of these stronger, highly hopped beers. And the question I've just put on the slide there is, could these October beers and stronger stock ales be considered the precursor to IPA? And there's a wonderful picture that's kindly provided by Steve Dunkley at Beer Nouveau in Manchester in the UK. Steve's a fantastic advocate and source of knowledge for historical brewing. And that picture there, you can see the colour of a stock ale that Steve recreated using a barley variety that would have been used in the kind of 1700s, which was Nottingham long year. So thanks, Steve, for that picture. But it would be absolutely impossible to talk about the story of IPA without focusing on George Hodgson's Brewery in London. And indeed, any presentation around export, and particularly the story of IPA, we have to mention the East India Company as well, which is a particular area of interest for me. And I think we could have a whole separate lecture just on the East India Company. So if you want to vote for that in the vote section, I'll happily deliver that presentation at a later date. But the East India Company was founded in 1600, and its headquarters were based in East London. And really, it absolutely dominated trade between the UK and India, really gaining its height onwards from the 1750s. At its height, it owned over 70 large ships. So just to give you an idea of the amount of goods going back and forth between London and India, it had a large private army, which at its peak was actually twice the size of the British Army. So they had a really big political and military presence. Initially, they were concerned in spices, in textiles like cotton, silk, tea. Also, and certainly the darker side of this story of trade and colonization was opium and slave trafficking as well. But they were obviously crucial to any exports to India. And this is where the story of George Hodgson comes in and the Bow Brewery. This brewery, again in East London, was founded in 1752 and was primarily, at least to begin with, was very much focused on porter production, as many of the London brewers were producing the famous dark beer that was very fashionable at the time. Now, this George Hodgson and the Bow Brewery are so important to IPA for a number of reasons, but we have to appreciate that they were very close to the East India Company in a number of ways. I mean, based on proximity alone, the headquarters of the East India Company were only 2 miles from the brewery. George Hodgson, I think it's fair to say, was an interesting character. I think by all accounts a ruthless businessman, and he got very close to the East India Company and specifically the officers on the ship. So each ship that was going to India had a certain proportion, a certain percentage of their cargo that they could use for their own means, for captains to try and make money, and beer became a very popular way for cargo going out to India to try and make a bit of money. So the reason that Hodgson became so close in part is because he extended incredibly favorable credit terms. He gave credit for 18 months, which is pretty incredible. We think suppliers now we may deal on 30-day credit terms, 60 days, but Hodgson was offering 18 months credit. So a lot of officers on these ships saw this as a way to make money. And really, there were many beers, many different styles being exported to India, but it was really the stock pale ale of Hodgson's Bow Brewery that started to gain favour. And we talked about briefly the conventions and the aging of October beer and that long conditioning process in barrels of between 2 and 3 years. And what the brewery did was typically age on site for a year, and then they'd be put on the boat, and that journey of circa 6 months, and the beer would age on the ships. They would mature, and there were obviously these kind of stories of the swell and the roll of the sea that would add to the secondary fermentation in the casks and then aid conditioning. And I guess one question is that Hodgson's Pale Ale, which became so dominant, certainly in the early export of beer to India, I mean, he really was a ruthless businessman. Any threat from any other breweries, he'd simply undercut them on price and try and beat off business that way. And couple that with these favorable credit terms, you've got a really ruthless businessman. But it was specifically the Pale Ale, Hodgson's Pale Ale, that became very popular going out to India. And so the question is, and you know, could we consider Hodgson's Pale Ale the first ever IPA? And I think it's fair to say that we can't call it the first IPA. It wasn't called an IPA. It was just a stock ale. It was just a pale ale. But certainly, we cannot overstate the importance of Hodgson's Bow Brewery in how IPA and crucially the export of beer to India developed. So it's very much London that dominated the early export of IPA, but fast forward a bit of time and going into the kind of 1820s, 1830s, it was Burton-upon-Trent that became the big rival to London. So Burton-upon-Trent is a trading town right in the centre of the UK. For those of you not too familiar with English geography, and there is evidence that brewing started as early as 1100 at Burton Abbey, so it's you know, steeped in history of brewing in Burton. There's a nice illustration on screen there, a view of Burton from the River Trent. You can see just how many brewery chimneys there were, stacks there. A town really known for its brewing tradition. Also, Burton has a very famous and very specific water composition, which has become so important to the Burton beers. It's incredibly high in calcium and sulfate, so this is said to enhance fermentation and the flocculation of yeast strains, provide very highly attenuated beers with good microstability and a very distinct flavour and character. So Burton, like London, became, you know, its brewing industry rose out of export really, and it was really down to the canal system, so the waterway system of England, that allowed it to become this kind of industrial powerhouse for beer production. First of all, we had the Trent Canal. So this was a canal which took water from Burton all the way to Hull on the north east coast of England. And this really opened up Burton. So they were able to ship beer along the Trent Canal, ship it down to London, and then from London go off anywhere. So the early Burton export, as we touched upon in the opening, was very much heading towards the Baltics and Russia, and specifically Baltic Porter, and what we, I guess, now retrospectively call Russian Imperial Stout. So the Burton breweries were very much focused on these strong, dark beers being transported to the Baltic. And this really allowed the town to flourish. But in, I believe it was 1783, was pretty much ground to a halt when the Russian authorities imposed high taxes. It was actually around 300% tax increase levied by the Russian authorities to promote local domestic products in Russia and the Baltics. And so we get that export of all those wonderful porters pretty much cut off overnight to Burton. So Burton was looking for new areas to export. And in the kind of 1820s, a number of Burton brewers were approached to try and replicate George Hodgson's Pale Ale. And I believe it was first Alsops that were approached about replicating this straw-coloured, highly hopped ale, which had become so popular in India. So George Hodgson's aggressive business practices and the variable quality of his beer was starting to annoy some people. So it was the Burton brewers that were approached to brew, I guess, what became IPA. And really then from that point, Burton then takes over as the powerhouse for IPA production. So we have big breweries like Alsops, Bass, Worthingtons, and many more actually. But by 1830, it was the Bass Brewery which was supplying as much as 40% of all IPA exports to India. So although I think we can say that IPA, the journey of IPA started in London, it is very much transferred to Burton-upon-Trent by the 1830s. We have there the BAS logo on screen, the red triangle, which I'm sure many of you know was the first ever registered trademark. And there we have the brewery logo of Alsops with the red right hand. So let's have a look at a typical recipe for this period. I mean, there are many examples that have been cited, but I wanted to focus on REID'S IPA, and this is from 1839. Hopefully you can see on screen, I've referenced and cited this as being from IPA, a fantastic book by Mitch Steele. Here we are, if you can see it on screen. And this recipe was provided by Ron Patterson. So let's just have a look at a few details of the recipe. It was 100% pale malt. The mashing, it was a single infusion of 70 degrees Celsius or 158 Fahrenheit, which is very high, even by today's standards. Liquor to grist ratio of 3.46 litres to a kilo of malt, a 75-minute boil, and the hopping was 11.5 grams a litre of Fuggles, which would have been from Kent in the south east of England, and it states here at 5.5% alpha acids, and these were added in at 3 stages throughout the boil. At the very start, 30 minutes towards the end and 15 minutes toward the end. So three different hop additions throughout the boil, and that seems reasonably common in some of these old IPAs. And then in terms of fermentation, my thanks to Ron for selecting Nottingham ale yeast, and this was fermented at a very precise 19.4 C. You know, God forbid it be 19.5 or 3. And then there was a dry hopping of 1.87 grams per litre, which is actually relatively tame by today's standards. But we see some of the brewing parameters there: a starting OG, a 14.25 Plato, an FG of 3.75 Plato, which gives us an attenuation of 73.7. So Nottingham typically would attenuate higher, but because we have this high single infusion mash temperature, we get that elevated final gravity. IBUs said to be circa 120 IBU, which just sounds crazy. Pretty pointless as well from a sensory standpoint when we consider that humans can't taste much beyond 80 IBU as the flavor threshold. So maybe it was so high as we've alluded to for this preservative quality. So that gives us an ABV of 5.8%, and typically the IPAs of this period would have been between kind of 5.5% and 7%. The color there is listed as 4 EBC. I think we should take that with a pinch of salt. Even with very low color malt, I think you'd struggle to achieve a color that low, but suffice to say it was a very light colored beer. So it gives us some indication of a typical recipe from the 19th century, and there are many more in Mitch Steele's fantastic book on IPA. So the question is, and the question we all want to ask is, what about yeast? Well, I think it's fair to say that little was known about yeast until the mid to late 1800s, and I guess one key question is what yeast would have been used in IPA, and it's a very difficult question to answer in some respects because there's so little record, so little knowledge of the strains and the cultures being used in the 1800s. There are some indications, however, and some of the recipes in the book IPA give us a clue. So just generally, having scanned through dozens of old recipes, a lot seem to be high attenuation. So maybe we might say 75 to 80% attenuation. Good alcohol tolerance. Obviously, a lot of these October stock and what became IPAs were relatively strong in alcohol. As I said, typically kind of 6 to 7% ABV, some higher as well. And again, it's some described as a clean flavor or aroma, and I think what they refer to as clean is probably it's POF negative, so we don't get these spicy clove kind of phenolic flavors that we might associate with wild yeasts. They don't produce much in terms of diacetyl, fusel alcohols, any of these kind of compounds we might associate as off flavors. But this is very much brewery dependent, and unfortunately, we haven't got all that information to go back through, but I think it's a very safe conclusion to say that there would have been very complex multi-strain house cultures. And indeed, some records do refer to a brewer's strain as culture as having multiple strains. The most I've seen, actually, there's one brewery in Burton which refers to having as many as 14 strains in their house culture, and that's a huge juggling out for the brewer to try and have to manage. And the question is how many of them were intentionally meant to be there. But a lot of these multi-strain cultures, unfortunately died out over time, and we'll have a look at the reasons why. And here are two of the culprits that may in part explain all these kind of interesting multi-strain ale cultures dying out. So in the 1800s, we have real development in scientific understanding, and Louis Pasteur, of course, was crucial to this, discovering that yeast was a living microorganism that was responsible for alcoholic fermentation. And then later in 1883, we have Hodgson, who developed the pure culture technique, isolating a single cell, a single yeast strain cell, and using his pure culture techniques to have to develop these very pure, clean yeast cultures. And the influence of that still lasts today, of course. Most brewers will use a single strain of pure culture yeast. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this had a really profound effect, not only in the industrialization of beer and the consistency and the scientific understanding, but on the flip side, those are all great things, but on the flip side, we lose so many native strains, so much diversity in cultures. And this is something that Lars Marius Garschol picks up on really well in his historical brewing techniques book. And we just here a bit of a plug for Lars. We were very grateful to have Lars present on a presentation on Kvike, which is available on the Lallemand Brewing YouTube channel and Facebook page. And we touched on this, that the development, the industrialization of beer, unfortunately, made us lose so many of these interesting yeasts, and no doubt would have given these IPAs some distinct character that we just don't quite appreciate now. So at the end of the 1900s, we have the decline of IPAs. We have this huge boom that started in London and was really taken over by the Burton brewers. But we have the decline in the late 1800s and into the 1900s. And there were many factors that saw the decline of IPA. I think, firstly, they just fall out of fashion to a certain extent. We know that tastes and trends come and go, and I think IPA was certainly not immune to this. So there was a movement generally towards lower alcohol, lower starting original gravities. Perhaps slightly later, the World War I, which had a very profound effect on Europe. European politics and society, for sure. Rationing and taxation, and tax becomes a very important reason of why original gravity started to lower. We also have the temperance movement, so societal pressures, and there's that great image on screen there, which is the drunkard's progress from glass to grave. And we have all these societal pressures as well on wanting to lower alcohol and even eradicate alcohol, which sounds like a hellish vision of society. And then as well, we have the rise of lager breweries in India. So if we refer back to these scientific advances by Hodgson and that pure culture technique, we coupled with things like refrigeration, we start to get the rise of lager breweries, and that happened in India. So we have the very start of lager starting to dominate everything, and IPA falling out of fashion in that sense. Later, we have prohibition in the US as well. So IPA production does continue. It does still happen in the UK, but we see it lose, it's watered down effectively. We see changes in flavor, in process, and crucially, a change to a lower ABV. So, in many ways, I think IPA loses its soul. And really, that's characterized throughout the 20th century. We've seen a great consolidation of industrial brewing. We see great homogeneity in beer styles, principally the rise of mass, kind of Pilsner and lager style beer, and flavor and style becomes very, very homogenized. And really, IPA lost its way and lost its popularity to a great extent in the 20th, certainly the first half of the 20th century. And it's not really until the late 1970s and into the 1980s that we start to get this counter-revolution against this homogenized and ultimately quite two-dimensional global beer scene. And so we have to talk about the start of craft brewing, and we all kind of know the story that, great pioneers like Fitz Maytag in San Diego, no, not San Diego, San Francisco, sorry, Ken Grossman and Bert Grantz, wanting to revisit these styles, this amazing history that we've just touched upon that started out in the kind of 18th and 19th century Britain. And it was really a discovery to rediscover flavor and these great, intensely flavored beers that became so popular. So the craft beer movement was a counter revolution to all this bland homogenization that had happened. And they were influenced by beers like Ballantine IPA, which was produced in the US, throughout the 20th century. And it was a case to some extent of reviving old beer styles, but obviously we now know as well it's creating new styles, it's experimenting with raw materials, and hops obviously, and specifically US hops, become very important to the story at this point. And the story of the Cascade hop is obviously crucial to the IPA movement starting to happen again in the 1980s and becoming more popular throughout the 1990s and into, where we are now. So we have the rediscovery. We have, again, this falling in love with IPA. So very highly hopped, very bitter, very aromatic, and really referring back to all those old kind of influences IPA that we've touched on. But now in 2020 we have this explosion in diversity. So IPA is not a single style of beer. I mean, just listing some on the screen there, we have English IPA, American IPA, West Coast and East Coast. And I think we unfortunately fall into that very binary dichotomy of, is it a West Coast, is it an East Coast? And I think we're almost thankfully beyond that argument now with just how much diversity there is in IPA. We obviously, going back to very strong ABVs, we have double and even triple IPAs. And then more recently, more kind of niche and specialist types of IPA. So the kind of Belgium influenced IPAs, white IPA, fruit IPA, and sour IPA, which I'm going to touch on a bit. But really, from looking back at history, we've taken IPA to something really exciting and new. And now I want to talk and focus specifically on the role of yeast and how important, how essential yeast is to modern IPA brewing. So, let's just start with some of the considerations for when you're looking at a yeast strain for IPA. What's the flavor of the strain? Is it going to be kind of accentuate the bitter flavors? Is it going to give a soft, sweeter finish to the beer? Is it going to give any defined characteristics, anything unique? Equally with the aroma, is it going to be neutral and clean? Is it going to allow the hops to shine through? Or is it going to impart fruity, estery flavors that are going to work in tandem with the hops to give a very three-dimensional kind of aroma? The attenuation of the beer, the yeast, is crucial as well. So on the screen there, and how well you can see, but that's an overlay fermentation. Same wort, same conditions, 5 different strains that we're going to look at in close detail very soon. You just see the difference in attenuation. So the more highly attenuated strain, which in this is Nottingham, versus a lower attenuating strain like Windsor, the difference in final gravity is nearly 2 Plato. So the sugars that the yeast strain will utilize is very important to the overall perception of the IPA. And crucially as well, the flocculation of the strain. Is it going to be flocculate very fast, or is it going to be a slow flocculator? Is it going to contribute a bit of haze to the beer, perhaps? So the ideal fermentation temperatures and the profile is very easy, is very crucial, sorry, to understand of the strain you're selecting. And also, you know, in relation to hops, in dry hopping, yeast and hop interactions, so this great, fascinating subject of biotransformation, you know, how does the yeast work actually in terms of interacting with hops? And we're going to have a look at this. So I'm kind of pleased to announce that kind of at Lallemand we're really focusing on not just, you know, selecting, say, you know, this is okay for IPA, etc., but really looking at a very 3-dimensional solutions package for IPA. And I'm going to focus on 5 main strains now. So, you know, as we say, it's a really interesting journey that we've taken. You know, when Hansen and Pasteur introduced this pure culture techniques, and we see this great shrinking of strains, and brewers using what is a very narrow range of yeast strains, we're now bringing the remit of companies like us at Lallemand is to bring back the diversity that we once lost. And I think to have 5 main strains focused on IPA is already a great start. So let's look at some of these. Now, this is where I'm going into interactive mode. So these are the products at Lallemand Brewing that we focus on. Premium yeast, of course, we have bacteria as well now for sour beers. Enzymes, and we'll talk about that in this presentation a bit more. We also specialize in nutrients, process aids, and sensory kits. We're going to dip into the yeast, so hopefully if I click on the yeast, we'll dip in. So we see some of our core range of yeast. So I'm going to start by focusing on a typical British strain, Nottingham. So we think back to that Reed IPA from 1839. They selected Nottingham as their yeast strain of choice, and indeed many of the older traditional IPAs from the 19th century call for Nottingham. And I think probably the reason for this is it's very alcohol tolerant. It's up to 14% that we state on our technical data information. It attenuates very highly. With Nottingham, it's very clean in terms of flavor and aroma, very neutral. So we see on the flavor wheel there, the defining character is very neutral. So it produces very low concentrations of fruity flavors and esters, etc. So it's very neutral. So you're going to get something that is going to allow that kind of bitterness and indeed the hop aroma to come through. So a great choice for the classic IPA. Equally, if we dip back in and we'll go to another traditional British strain, Windsor, which in recent years has become really popular for kind of reviving some of these classic styles. So why it's a great contrast to Nottingham is that it crucially doesn't utilize malted triose, so the trisaccharide sugar, which is 3 glucose molecules together. So we get a much lower attenuation with Windsor, somewhere in the region of kind of 65 to 70%. So it's great if you want a much fuller, sweeter finish. Might be good for a lower ABV option, although it does go up to 12%. So also we see on the flavor wheel as well, a bit more on the fruit character, specifically with Windsor. I describe that as almost a marmalade flavor, a bitter orange kind of a flavor. So very different to the Nottingham yeast, but again, a very kind of classic old English fruity ester yeast. And then taking a trip across the Atlantic, we have BRY 97, the really classic West Coast IPA yeast. So this originally came from the Siebel Institute Yeast Bank. And really, like not quite as neutral as Nottingham, but I guess we would very much describe it as clean, and the attenuation to this is key as well. So with these yeast, this type of yeast or West Coast yeast, you have a much higher attenuation, 80 to 85%. So you want that dry finish to the beer. You want that clean flavor and clean aroma to allow those nice modern hops to come through. So not very slight fruit character, but very, very slight. And this strain in particular is actually really good at promoting hop biotransformation. We'll go into that very shortly. Dipping back out, we'll again contrast with another American strain, New England. So this was kind of added a couple of years ago to our range, and relatively similar in terms of attenuation to the Nottingham, to the BRY 97, but the flavour and the aroma are worlds apart from these strains. So you get a much more pronounced ester character. So I think if we were to cite the key development, the key distinction of East versus West, is that the East Coast, which we'd associate with the New England yeast, is that you're wanting to select a yeast strain that has a very intense aromatic profile that is going to work in tandem with the hops. So that's crucial to producing these new styles of IPA, is that we have a highly aromatic yeast strain. And then hopefully from there, I can introduce, and I'm pleased to introduce our brand new Verdant IPA yeast, which is due for commercial release a week today, 28th of July. So you're getting a slight insight, just a week ahead of the game here, but we're adding this as another new critical tool to IPAs. And we describe the high attenuation of something like a Nottingham or a BRY versus a lower attenuation of a traditional kind of older British yeast strain like Windsor. And really this yeast strain fits somewhere nicely in between the two. It's not as high attenuating, but nor is it really low, and thus contributing a sweet finish. And this is really critical to this yeast strain. So instead of a dry finish, you get a nice, really balanced, smooth finish to the beer, which seems to be very much in keeping with the kind of modern IPA style. So less on the dry finish and the bitterness, but more on a smooth base where we can throw lots of late hops and dry hops at it to increase the aroma. So I almost see it as a distinction between East and West, and a kind of third way, nicely sitting in between in terms of attenuation. And we have these wonderful, very distinct peachy aromas coming from it. Slight bit of kind of vanilla sweetness as well, but I look forward to talking more about this strain in the coming weeks. Make sure to look out for promotional stuff online. We've got some videos to release. We'll be doing announcements, of course, next week, but I'm really excited to get this yeast strain out there and add it to our IPA solutions. Obviously, we've got those 5 main strains to focus on, but, you know, it'd be rude not to consider other strains as well. So, you know, Kvike has been a huge new story in brewing. And if I can refer you to our YouTube and Facebook pages, we have the fantastic Kvike presentation by Lars Marius Garskjold, and I'd really urge you, if you haven't seen it already, to go back and learn more about Kvike. But it's becoming very popular to ferment IPA styles with Kvike, and I've got a picture there of Glen Affric Brewery, their 6.5% Ingemund IPA, absolutely stunning modern IPA, which is fermented with the LALBREW Voss, which we launched earlier this year. You can see a picture of it there. So too, there are other niche styles as well. So something like a white IPA. So using a very delicate wit yeast. So nothing like a more powerful Hefeweizen strain, but a nice delicate wit strain with a kind of hoppy IPA profile. We might think of something like Allagash White as a kind of something that we might think of as a kind of white IPA. And then a Belgium IPA, I've put a picture there of Stone's Cali Belgique IPA, which I tried for the first time about, I don't know, 9-10 years ago. And I thought, IPA fermented with a Belgium yeast, that sounds ridiculous. And it was an absolutely stunning beer. So, I don't think we should be necessarily confined by tradition or just looking at a group of yeast, but see, what yeast you could put into an IPA. Go out and have a play. Why not? So that's just some data on LALBREW. Voss, of course, we can download all our data sheets from the Lallemand Brewing website online. And we launched this, of course, earlier in the year. It's got quite a high attenuation, so in keeping with what we'd like for, a nice, clean, dry finish. It flocculates incredibly well. Very slight, subtle orangey flavour to it, which works very well with modern hops. So, and I guess the advantage of Kvike, if you don't already know, is the extremely fast fermentation kinetics. So we can ferment at 40 degrees C and even ferment 6.5% in 48 hours. So it's becoming a really popular option for IPA for great reasons. So getting great feedback for LALBREW Voss on IPAs. And then there's the Abbey style, so doing these Belgium styles, you get a lot more boozy, fruity flavors, tropical flavors, as well as the classic, banana and clove as well. Robust yeast can go up to 14% alcohol. And, that Belgium IPA never really took off, never really, came outside of the US really, but I certainly think they're really interesting beers. And then something like a classic wit year, a lot more delicate. So you do get the kind of banana and slight clove notes, but quite soft and balanced. And I think those nice, delicate flavors we'd associate with wit and blanche can work very well with kind of modern hopping as well. And then there's co-fermentation as well. So the idea, just the image to get in our heads on screen there, the artist's palette. So using all these different hues, these different colors, textures, and why not combine yeast? And I know many of you watching do. It's certainly not uncommon for modern brewers to blend commercially available yeast for specific purposes. So I've just put on screen a few examples of feedback from customers that are quite popular options. And we generally refer to co-fermentations in two ways. So you're looking for functional advantages, whether you want to, I don't know, say get a specific attenuation or a specific flocculation that you can achieve with just the one strain. And then there's kind of co-fermentation for the flavor and aroma as well, and some great examples. We think, just for example, the combination of using Windsor, so we get this orangey, marmalade-y, estery note to it, but we get a much lower attenuation. So we can combine that with the BRY 97, which is very neutral in flavor. So you'll retain the character of the Windsor, but complete the higher attenuation as well. So there's some great options there. And of course, we can consider co-fermentation with bacteria producing a sour IPA, a potential combination as well. And I just wanted to share an example of this. This is a fantastic sour IPA produced by Vocation Brewery, not far from me in Yorkshire, in the north of England. And congratulations to Matt Howgate and his team for producing this beer. This is a very modern IPA style, and they produced a wort in the brew house, which was unhopped. They transferred it to the FV at 35C, and they first pitch in our wild brew sour pitch bacteria, 35C being a real optimal temperature for that bacteria, and they let the souring happen in FV overnight, and then pitched in LALBREW Voss, which also operates in that optimal range of 35 to 40 C. So you can see how those that combination of the sour pitch and Voss, they're in the same range. So, you know, Matt had the great idea to use that as a co-fermentation, and it's a sequential inoculation effectively, but they'd soured and fermented within 48 hours, which was crazy. And then they did this huge dry hop to inhibit the bacteria and effectively, you know, make that safe to then go on. But it's absolutely stunning beer. Added a really nice, refreshing acidity to it. Then you get all this fantastic aroma coming from the Kvite, the LALBREW Voss, and the obviously modern hops. And then just to finish, I think, you know, we've looked at some of the past conventions of IPA and what defined IPA, and some of the modern options. We have, you know, now discovering all these yeast and crucially characterizing them. And if we think about, well, what does the future of yeasts hold for IPA? And I think biotransformation certainly has a role to play in this. So we can look at biotransformation in two respects. Can look at the hop-bound glycosides. So this is liberating hop oil. So this is when an oil is bound to a carbohydrate, so specifically a glucose, and we have the enzyme beta-glucosidase, which hydrolyzes that bond between the oil and the carbohydrate. And in principle releases that oil into the beer. And so of course we've characterized our IPA yeasts for the expression of these enzymes, and crucially for beta-glucosidase we have BRY and Nottingham being great examples of potential strains to use for this reaction. But also, and this is where I think biotransformation is going, is really focusing on thiols from hops. So these are in very low concentration in hops, but they're very potent. And it's really looking at yeast strains that will liberate these. So we have the diagram there of the conversion of an inodorous precursor, and it is the enzyme beta lyase which hydrolyzes that and creates a volatile thiol, which is then potentially adding more aroma into the beer. So in terms of beta lyase activity, we see a different story in the strains, and the soon to be launched Verdant IPA was, you know, really high with this, and that's already looking like a really fantastic option for increasing aroma in beer, is looking for strains like this. And interestingly, Nottingham had quite high production of beta lyase as well. So this is, I think you're going to hear a lot more about transformation from Lallerman Brewing, and be sure to look out for some special lectures coming up in the coming months, as well as some new products as well, just giving you a bit of insight to what we're working on there. But this is, I think, going to play a huge role in the future of IPA as well. So really, for companies like us, it's really starting to characterize, deep diving on these strains and understanding them, how they can be used, and how you can fine-tune performance to really nail the IPA that you want to produce. So just to conclude very quickly, obviously we have this very rich history in IPA. It evolved as an export beer, and we've got all these fantastic stories, starting with George Hodgson in the East India Company, and then the BURTON brewers like Bass and Alsop taking over production. The craft beer revolution from the late 70s onwards has really revived interest in the style, following decades of decline, and now you know, kind of 40 years or so from the start of the craft beer revolution, where we've seen this explosion in diversity of IPA styles. And hopefully I've got across that the selection of yeast, the yeast strain, is critical to defining the modern IPA styles and achieving these beers very accurately. So strain selection and characterization is very important. And I guess, again, to question what's the future of the role of yeast in IPA, well, we have a lot more research to do. No doubt more strains will come on the market, and we will continue to characterize to give our expertise. And the IPA solutions that I took upon, so focusing on those 5 core strains, we're going to have some really great published documents ready for you all to see that lay out very precisely and in great detail what the differences in the strains are and what you can expect, how to achieve the IPA you want to. And I think the yeast and hop interactions are going to be very vital to the story of IPA going forward. So that's it for my presentation. We obviously contact information, the Lallemand Brewing website, lallamandbrewing.com. You can download data sheets from any of the strains I've discussed, and we have great resources on there. Of course, you can find out more about Process Aids and the Siebel Institute in Chicago, America's oldest and most prestigious brewing school. If you want to learn more about yeast and get, really geek out, they have fantastic modules on fermentation science. So I'd encourage you to look on some of their modules focusing on yeast and fermentation. And of course, stay up to date with our latest news. You can sign up for our newsletter. I think we should have a link to that to post into the comments. But we cover all new product updates, and we've had a lot of new products recently, including the Verdant IPA. But we also share technical and R&D updates. And of course, you can keep up to date on social media as well. So I will stop there. How do I stop presenting? Stop sharing, and I'll come back into presentation mode. I have rushed through them, and I've gone way over time. I could almost hear my marketing team screaming at me to hurry up. So apologies for overrunning slightly. I hope you found the content interesting. So I'll go now into questions. So I see there are a few questions here, and I'll start with a question from Jack Walker. Love Lane Brewing in Liverpool. Hello, Jack, my friend. Great that you've been able to join the lecture, and thanks for your question. So here we are. I was very impressed with the Verdant yeast strain when we trialed it, and great, thanks for that feedback. Definitely got a touch of that vanilla, slightly sweet character. Would I be right in saying that it's a good candidate for top cropping and repitching? Great question, Jack. And the short answer is yes. It's actually proving a very successful candidate for cropping and repitching. And I guess this gives me great opportunity to say thanks to all the breweries, including Love Lane, where Jack is the head brewer, for doing so many trials on characterizing, putting this Verdant yeast through its paces. It's critical, obviously, that as a company we understand all aspects of the strain before we launch it to the market. So we've got this incredible data on the Verdant strain that we will be sharing with you in the coming weeks. And one of the key aspects, as Jack's asking there, is its suitability for cropping. And one key character of this specific strain is that it has a very prominent krausen, a very prominent yeast head. During fermentation, it's very vigorous, and that makes it very suitable for top cropping. So if you've got fermentation vessels that allow, so I'm thinking more traditional kind of British and maybe even more traditional German ale vessels, these kind of more open, wider vessels that you can skim off the top, it makes a really good candidate to be able to top crop. It also makes a really good candidate for bottom cropping as well. And we had another one of our partners trialing the Yeast Unity Brewery in Southampton, the UK, that were very kindly shared their cropping and repitching regime for using modern cylindrical conical vessels for bottom cropping and repitching, with really great cell concentrations and fantastic viabilities for repitching. So I hope that kind of answers the questions, and we will be, very transparent in sharing that information on best practice procedures. We already have, in fact, a best practice procedure for cropping and repitching, which can be downloaded from the LALBREW Brewing website. So thanks for that question, Jack. Tony, hi there in Denmark, Tony. Rob, how do you consider IPA with a Kvike strain? Is that a match made in heaven? Great question, Tony, and thanks for asking that. I hope all's well with you, and I hope you've had a chance to brew with the Voss. As I rather hurriedly kind of went over in detail, that the feedback on using LALBREW Voss, which is our first commercial Kvike strain, which was released earlier this year, it's such a great candidate IPA, and it's proving really popular. Again, for many reasons. I think just because of the speed is really interesting. But in terms of the actual character of the yeast, you've got that attenuation range of kind of 80 to 85%. So it's really in keeping with some of these high attenuating yeast strains that we would say kind of classic IPA yeast. So it's really great in terms of attenuation. But you also get this really nice, subtle orange note as well. It's not overpowering. It's not, blow your head off in terms of its aroma, but it's a really subtle fruit character that works very well with modern IPA styles. And in fact, in terms of biotransformation as well, it looks to have good activity for, I can't remember which, for the Voss, which way around it is. I think it might be beta lyase, but it certainly does seem to be a match made in heaven, which is strange in some respects, because the traditional beers made with Kvike certainly would not be in keeping with these modern IPA styles. They would have been very much the other way, malt forward, strong, slightly sweet. But it does seem to be a great candidate for IPA, and I see more and more breweries producing IPAs made with Kvike as well. And then you've got, of course, the advantage of the incredibly fast fermentation times, that if you can ferment in under 48 hours very cleanly with no real need to do much conditioning because of how clean the Kvike strains are, which is crazy when you think you're fermenting at 40 degrees C, that you can really shorten down IPA production time. So, taking from a kind of 5 to 7 day fermentation time down to 2 is of real benefit for brewers. So thanks for that, Tony. Next question over to France. One's been voted up, so I'll answer this one first. Sorry, I don't know who is asking the question, but hi, Rob. What other beer styles have you tried with the new Verdant IPA strain? Obviously, it's really new, but wondering in which way also to use this strain other than IPA. Absolutely fantastic question, and I'm really glad that's been asked. Obviously, we'll be doing a lot more information specifically on Verdant. I think I'll get the chance to present to you all again in the coming. Oh, it's from Martin at the Malt Miller. Hi, Martin, and thanks for all your work so far on involved in this strain. But it's a great question, and although it's being positioned and primarily as an IPA yeast, it's a great all-round strain. So it's great on kind of as an all-round IPA strain, from anything from kind of pale ales right up to double, triple IPA, great for New England IPA. But it's absolutely fantastic and fed back from this when we were looking at this strain from really from the brewery. That they James Heffron, the head brewer at Verdant, said it was great on more traditional malt forward British styles. If we think of bitters and malt forward styles like that, and it's also fantastic on dark beers. So that's been a real key focus for some of the recent trials we've done. And I know Unity Brewery in Southampton have produced a porter and a really big stout with it, which have turned out wonderful. So we think about that smooth, balanced mouthfeel that this strain gives, that goes really well to that perception of mouthfeel on dark beer. So again, those like rightfully as you say, Reiki, though, those kind of nice fruit notes and that touch of vanilla lending itself perfectly to dark beer. Also, as well, it seems to cope with higher concentrations of lactic acid, so it copes with low pH very well. So that's the one thing that is possibly missing from data that I'd really like to focus on in the coming weeks is use on sour beers. So a challenge for any home brewers or any brewers that managed to get hold of this strain early on, definitely try it on sours as well. The indications are that it works really well on that as well. So I think it's going to prove to be not just great for IPA, but a fantastic, reliable, all-round strain, kind of house strain. I'm so excited just about the praise it's received in feedback. Then over to France, Vincent. Hi, Vincent. Hope you're well. Great that you managed to join the presentation today. Will the Verdant IPA yeast be available worldwide? Yes, very simple question. It's being released across the globe at the same time, 28th of July, and it'll be ready at the same time in 500 grams as well as 11-gram sachets, so available to home brewers exactly at the same time as commercial brewers as well. So really excited to begin to launch this over the coming weeks. So thanks for that question, Vincent. And then last question I can see here from Hernan. Hi, Hernan, hope you're well. Hi, could this yeast saturate sweetly if caramel and crystal malts are used, i.e. a red IPA? Forgive my ignorance. If you want to put any elaboration on that, Hernan, that'd be really helpful. But I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're talking, will it finish a bit sweeter if you're using kind of more complex Cara and crystal malts? And yes, is the short answer to that. I think one of the real key factors of this IPA strain, it's very responsive to sugar spectrum. So changing the mass profile, it seems very sensitive to adjustments. You can really fine tune tune the results and the attenuation by changing the mash, including using some of these other malts like crystal and Cara malts. So it will really respond and attenuate less if you add, higher proportion of those type of malts in. So great question, and I look forward to getting feedback from brewers on adding more of these different types of malt in. And another question from Thomas Baldwin. Have you got any information on whether amino acid profile in the wort impacts activity of beta lyase in your yeast? A fantastic question, Thomas. The short answer is no, certainly not yet. I think when it comes to biotransformation and indeed nutrition, as well, we're really just starting to scratch the surface in terms of brewing science. So obviously we're currently going through a lot of characterization work on all strains, and with a key focus on beta lyase activity. So we've got, hopefully in the coming months, we'll have a lot more information in this area to share with you. And I think when we were talking in the presentation about what the future of yeast's role in IPA presentation holds, I think this is a real area where companies like ours, focused on yeast and fermentation, and indeed hop merchants, will hopefully unite to bring some really interesting, groundbreaking science to the market. But I think generally speaking, nutrition is not something we pay a huge amount of interest to in brewing, purely on the basis that, you know, good quality malt provides such a great source of nitrogen, generally speaking. And I think brewers, we often get a bit lazy, dare I say, with when it comes to nutrition. We don't focus on it in perhaps the way we should do. And this is a lot more of interest and technical relevance to the wine world, where they very much look on specific nutritional requirements during fermentation and addition points. And I think there's going to be more and more of this looked into in coming years, with specific relation to nutrition, and perhaps being influenced by the wine world, and seeing a lot more bespoke nutrition solutions as well. And you know, I'd like to think we'll be leading the way on that as well. So I'll certainly add that to the questions for our R&D team. It's a fantastic question, and unfortunately I wasn't able to elaborate on that further at this point. And I've just realised, actually, I did miss a question there, one from John Moore. Apologies there, John. But can you tell us a bit more about how the collaboration with Verdant came about? What makes the yeast special difference to other Spains, and any tips for brewing with it? Well, fantastic question. And as I've already alluded to, we're going to be doing some presentations in the coming weeks, really going deep specifically into the Verdant strain, and James from Verdant will be joining us to go through the nitty-gritty of the strain, and how best to fine-tune it. But essentially the yeast came about when we were launching our New England strain. It was in the kind of autumn, winter of 2017. We, like we do for all new product releases, we're looking with partners, breweries to work with to trial strains, and Verdant were obviously starting to make noise and produce some great IPAs. So I approached James, you know, would you like to try this New England strain? Be fantastic to get your feedback. And they tried the strain, gave us great feedback, and I'm pleased to say they still use it in a number of their beers today. But James kind of came back to me and said, yeah, we have this other strain that we've been working with for IPAs that we use. We think, you know, it's got something different about it. We think it'd be a great value for other brewers to use. Would you like to have a look at it? And that's really how the conversation started. So the strain that they had the culture they had rather had 3 strains in it: 2 Saccharomyces cerevisiae, 1 non-Saccharomyces strain, and it was this. It was one of the cerevisiae strains that was isolated, put on a slant, and sent over to our R&D lab in Montreal. So, you know, that was kind of 2.5 years ago, and I was actually looking through the genetic report for this strain recently, and it was the genetic report was published on October the 17th, 2018, my birthday. So the stars were aligned, as they say. But we started obviously looking at the strain. It was actually not until last spring our R&D team looked at some of the fermentation kinetics and crucially from a production standpoint, the growth and the drying potential of the strain. And it came back that it was looking like it would be a fantastic yeast strain to produce. So it all kind of pushed the button to fast track that happening. And obviously then it takes a heck of a lot of R&D development to get commercial strain into dry production. So it was really from last July, August time right up to the new year that we developed that in terms of production. And then the past couple of months have been focused on getting trials out there in real life. So with breweries like Love Lane, Unity, people at Polly's Brewery, obviously Verdant as well, and Brew York, and then globally as well. We've had loads of brewers in the US, in China, in Spain, in Italy, in France and Belgium recently, and these have all been really key to us getting a very three-dimensional picture of this yeast. And any tips for brewing? It's a very easy strain to use. It's really forgiving. So standard pitch rate, 50 grams a hectoliter, 0.5 grams per liter. It's very robust. It starts fermentation quickly. There's not really much of a lag phase. We recommend a range of 18 to 22 C, so very much in keeping with a warm ale yeast fermentation, and it will go very fast. It's very vigorous, so I'd recommend pitching at kind of 18, 19 and allowing a rise up to 20, 21 C, and getting those nice fruity notes out. It'll attenuate quite quickly, so you'll get the kind of primary fermentation done in 3 or 4 days, depending on the OG, maybe slightly longer if you're going up to, that kind of 6-7% or even higher for double, triple IPA, but good strong Biformer. So keep it in that nice 18 to 22 C range. And then in terms of dry hopping, there are loads of ways people can do it. And again, what we didn't have the chance to go into today was when do you add your hops, and relating to biotransformation, is there any benefit from using the strain whilst it's in contact with the hops, i.e. adding hops into at some point during fermentation, or do you add them after? Now, my personal preference, and it's only a personal preference, I would always dry hop post fermentation. So you've completed the attenuation. The yeast strain has done its thing, and with Verdant, you've got that beta lyase activity as well to help with the aroma, and certainly that's how it's looking. And then you can have a nice warm finish, incorporate a diacetyl rest into the beer, which I guess is good practice for any IPA brewing, and then lower the temperature down somewhere between 15 and 17 C, introduce the dry hops, recirc if you can for a couple of days, drop the dry hops, and then condition the beer. That seems to be working very well, and again, our thanks to so many brewers that have helped with looking at best practice for fermentation profiles. But all the information's on the data sheets, and as I say, we'll be doing presentations with Verdant, going really deep on this strain, so look out for all that. But it's a very forgiving strain. You'll not go far wrong with it, and really hope you enjoy it, and look forward to getting everyone's feedback over the coming weeks. So that's all the questions done. I've gone over time as usual. My team will be laughing because they know I like to go on in presentations. So Marie asking the question there, is anyone thirsty? Well, I know I am. It's been very rude of me not to have an IPA in hand, but that's just so I could do all that talking. But I think I'll go and have one now. So thank you everyone for your great questions. I hope I answered them well enough. Please look out for presentations coming up. As I say, we've got loads to focus on in terms of biotransformation. and some exciting product launches with the verdant yeast as well. So I'll leave it there for now. We'll please get in touch with me or any of the Lallerman Brewing team to ask any questions. So thanks for your attention, and happy brewing, everyone. I hope you enjoy your next IPA brewing, and to continue to develop and work with us in pushing IPA even further along. I think the question we will ask is IPA here to stay? Yes, it is. Cheers and bye for now.